Hiroshima, in the early days of August 1945, was still a city that breathed, that moved, that tried to maintain a sense of ordinary life amid a Japan exhausted by war. Unlike Tokyo or Osaka, Hiroshima had not yet suffered a large-scale bombing. This made it one of the few cities that still retained a relatively intact structure. Narrow streets winding along the Ota River, stone and wooden bridges, connecting small islands within the city, residential neighborhoods interwoven with military barracks, logistics factories, and administrative offices of the Imperial Japanese Army. The morning of the 6th of August, 1945 began like any other. The sun rose early, its light spreading evenly across dark tiled rooftops and weathered wooden walls. The sound of wooden clogs echoed along the streets as school children, mobilized for labor, walked to clear houses and create fire breaks, a familiar defensive measure against conventional air raids. Shopkeepers opened their stalls. Homemakers prepared breakfast. Civil servants adjusted their uniforms before heading to their offices. In the memories of many survivors, Hiroshima that morning was strangely quiet, a clear blue sky without a single cloud. That silence would later become a haunting detail, as if nature itself had paused its breath before an event humanity had never known. On the other side of the Pacific Ocean, the decision to use an entirely new kind of weapon had been made weeks earlier. The Manhattan Project, the United States program to research and build the atomic bomb, had reached its final stage after years of mobilizing scientific, industrial, and military resources on an unprecedented scale. The Trinity test in the New Mexico desert on the 16th of July 1945 had demonstrated the terrifying power of nuclear fission. From that moment on, World War II crossed into an entirely new ethical and technological threshold. Hiroshima was not chosen at random. The city was a major military logistics center, home to the headquarters of Japan's Second General Army, responsible for defending the southern regions of the archipelago. More importantly, Hiroshima was still largely intact, allowing American military planners to observe and assess the effects of an atomic bomb on a real, functioning city. For the people living there, all of these strategic calculations were completely invisible, hidden behind the calm blue sky of a summer morning. Around 8 a.m., air raid sirens sounded and were quickly canceled. American reconnaissance aircraft had appeared over Hiroshima in the days before, but no attacks had followed. People had grown accustomed to such false alarms, and many returned to their daily routines. According to the testimonies of the Hibakusha survivors of the explosion, it was this very familiarity that led them not to seek shelter, with no sign at all of what was about to happen. At 8:15 a.m., a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay, flying at an altitude of about 9,400 meters, released an object roughly 3 meters long and weighing more than 4 tons. During its few dozen seconds of free fall, no one on the ground realized that human history was crossing an irreversible boundary. For many survivors, that moment was later described as a void in memory, a rupture between before and after, where time no longer flowed in the same way. The flash came before the sound. It was not the light of ordinary fire, but an intense blue-white glare, powerful enough to pierce closed eyelids and imprint the shadows of people, trees, and bridges onto walls. Those near the hypocenter had no time to feel fear. Many were almost instantly vaporized by temperatures reaching thousands of degrees Celsius. Others farther away were thrown through the air, crushed by the blast wave, or severely burned as their clothes and skin ignited. Most surviving testimonies, however, come from those who were not at the center of the explosion. They were students, workers, nurses, soldiers, ordinary people who survived in what they later called an incomprehensible survival. Some recalled being temporarily blinded by the flash, followed by a deafening roar as if the sky itself had collapsed. When they stood up, the familiar city had become an alien landscape, where landmarks had vanished and direction no longer held meaning. Streets that had once been busy were now blocked by rubble. The bridges, important architectural symbols of Hiroshima, many of them remained standing in a strangely defiant way, while the surrounding wooden houses were flattened, The dome of the Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall, later known as the Atomic Bomb Dome, still stood with its steel frame exposed amid the devastation. In that moment, no one could have imagined that this structure would become a global symbol of memory and warning for humanity. Survivors began searching for loved ones in a chaos filled with silence. At first, there was little crying, as many were too stunned to comprehend their loss. Later accounts emphasize the eerie quiet after the explosion, broken only by the sound of fires burning and faint groans rising from beneath the rubble. In that landscape, concepts of military victory or defeat became meaningless. What remained was only the fragile struggle for survival of each individual in a city that had been forever transformed. The next part of the story is not only about the immediate destructive power of a single bomb, but about a long journey of memory, illness, discrimination, and the effort of survivors to reclaim their dignity. But to understand the depth of those consequences, one must pause at this first moment when Hiroshima did not yet know that its name would be forever bound to one of the darkest chapters in. Immediately after the flash of light and the shockwave swept across Hiroshima, the boundary between life and death was no longer defined by distance or time, but by cruel, random factors. A shielding wall, a bend in the road, a wooden sliding door that happened to be closed in time. Those who remained alive stood up in a state of incomplete awareness, not fully understanding what they had just experienced. Many later accounts described the sensation as waking from a nightmare, only to realize that the familiar world had vanished forever. There was no command center, no rescue forces on standby, and no clear understanding of the catastrophe that had just occurred. The city's communication systems were almost completely destroyed within the first seconds. Fire stations, hospitals, and police posts near the hypocenter were flattened or severely damaged. Surviving medical personnel, many of them seriously injured themselves, were forced to make life and death decisions under conditions of absolute scarcity, where bandages, medicine, and even clean water became rare luxuries. Survivors began moving toward the rivers, driven by an instinctive search for water to soothe the burning pain spreading across their bodies. The Ota River and its branches quickly became gathering points for thousands of severely injured people. Many later recalled seeing charred bodies drifting silently on the surface, while those still able immersed themselves in the water to ease their pain, unaware that the river was contaminated with radiation and toxic debris. In the memories of the Hibakusha, the image of humanity at that moment lay beyond all familiar moral and social frameworks. Clothes were burned away, skin peeled and hung in strips, and many people walked in silence, with their arms held out in front of them to keep burned flesh from touching their bodies. Others called out the names of loved ones in despair, receiving no answers amid a sea of strangers. No one clearly understood the cause of the disaster. Some believed a new and extraordinarily powerful bomb had been used, while others thought it was an unprecedented natural calamity. As fires began to spread throughout the city, forming firestorms fueled by intense heat and oxygen-drawing winds, Hiroshima became a deadly maze. The narrow streets and wooden residential districts, hallmarks of Japanese urban architecture at the time, became perfect fuel for the flames. Many survivors later recounted being trapped between two paths that both led toward death, staying and being burned alive, or running through streets filled with corpses and debris in the fragile hope of finding safety. In the first hours, there was no concept of radiation victims. Those who were not seriously injured at first believed they had been fortunate to escape death. They helped others, searched for family members, and even tried to fight fires with the most primitive means available. Only days, even weeks later, when hair began to fall out, sores appeared that would not heal, and bodies weakened for no clear reason, did they realize they had suffered an invisible injury, one that was prolonged and impossible to escape. By the afternoon of August 6, black rain began to fall in some outlying areas of Hiroshima. The thick drops, containing radioactive ash and debris from the explosion, left dark stains on clothing and skin. In extreme thirst, many people drank this rainwater, unaware of its long-term consequences. Later testimonies would describe the black rain as one of the most haunting symbols of the disaster. representing the fusion of nature and technology in a form of destruction never before witnessed. As night fell, Hiroshima was no longer a city of lights, sounds, and daily rhythms. Darkness enveloped a completely shattered space, where scattered fires still burned like unhealed wounds. Survivors gathered into small groups, not by organization but out of fear and the need to cling to the presence of other human beings. In that darkness, questions began to form, though no one yet had answers. What had happened? Why it had happened? And whether the world would ever return to what it had been. The first hours after the explosion laid the foundation for a long journey of pain and memory, not only for those who survived in Hiroshima, but for all humanity. The catastrophe did not end when the flames died down or when the sun set. It had only just begun, seeping into bodies, minds, and history, shaping the lives of millions over the decade. In the days following the explosion, Hiroshima entered a period that many survivors would later describe as a gray zone of time, where the boundaries between yesterday and today, between life and death, became blurred. The city could no longer function as a social organism. The structures that had sustained daily order, medical services, administration, logistics, were destroyed or rendered completely inoperative. In this context, the disaster no longer took the visible form of fire and thunderous sound, but transformed into something else, slower, quieter, yet no less merciless. The hospitals that remained standing were quickly overwhelmed. Hiroshima Red Cross Hospital and several medical facilities on the city's outskirts became gathering points for thousands of wounded people. Far beyond their capacity to cope, many doctors and nurses had been killed in the blast. Those who survived were forced to work under conditions of extreme scarcity, little light, almost no medicine, and no knowledge of how to treat injuries that had never before been documented. Burns did not resemble ordinary thermal burns and failed to heal despite careful bandaging. Minor wounds suddenly turned necrotic, spread rapidly, and led to severe infections. In the first days, many victims appeared to be recovering. They could walk, talk, and even help others. But only days later, strange symptoms began to emerge. Hair fell out in clumps, skin changed color, gums bled uncontrollably. Prolonged high fevers quickly drained their strength. Doctors recorded a sudden rise in deaths that could not be explained by familiar medical causes. Only much later did the concept of radiation sickness gradually take shape, along with the realization that many people had effectively been sentenced to death from the moment the first flash of light appeared. For the Hibakusha, the greatest fear lay not only in death itself, but in uncertainty. No one knew who would live, who would die, or when. Some watched friends and family members who seemed to have survived the danger suddenly collapse. These deaths were not dramatic or loud. They occurred quietly, leaving those who remained with a profound sense of helplessness. In many testimonies, survivors' guilt began to take root during this period, as people asked themselves why they had lived while others had not been given the chance. At the same time, Japan's central government was forced to confront an unprecedented reality. Information about the explosion was tightly controlled in the early days, partly due to chaos, partly because no one fully understood the nature of the weapon that had been used. Japanese scientists were dispatched to Hiroshima to investigate, carrying rudimentary measuring instruments and limited knowledge of radiation. Their initial reports, though incomplete, confirmed that this was not a conventional bombing, but a phenomenon that lay beyond all previous norms of warfare. In the daily lives of survivors, physical pain gradually merged with psychological trauma. Many lost the ability to sleep, haunted by the flash of light in their memories. Loud noises triggered panic, while long stretches of silence recalled the terrifying stillness that followed the explosion. Children, even those who survived, carried mental wounds that would last a lifetime, shaping how they viewed the world and their place within it. When news of the second atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki on the 9th of August 1945 reached Hiroshima, the initial shock turned into an existential fear. If this could happen to Hiroshima, then nowhere was safe. And when Japan announced its surrender on August 15, the end of the war did not bring a sense of victory or liberation for the survivors. Instead, It left a void, in which they had to begin confronting the long-term consequences of an event that lay beyond human understanding and acceptance. The days following the explosion laid the foundation for a different life for the Hibakusha, a life shaped by illness, memory, and social discrimination. Yet, at the same time, from those dark days emerged the first seeds of collective memory and the movement against nuclear weapons. Even though it would take many years before their voices were. After the war ended, Hiroshima did not immediately enter a period of rebirth. Instead, it fell into a prolonged silence, where life continued atop losses that had not yet been fully named or understood. The city began to be cleared. Roads were reopened. Makeshift buildings rose from the rubble. But for the Hibakusha, the true battle was only just beginning, a struggle against the long-term effects of radiation, against forgetting, and against the wary looks of their own compatriots. In post-war Japanese society, where poverty and scarcity were widespread, survivors of the atomic bombing were quickly associated with illness and uncertainty. Many were denied employment once employers learned they came from Hiroshima or Nagasaki, fearing they would be weak, chronically ill, or carry some invisible form of contamination. Families with daughters who were Hibakusha faced serious difficulties arranging marriages, due to rumors that radiation could be inherited and would result in children born with deformities. Later testimonies reveal that the psychological pain caused by social discrimination was no less severe than physical injury. Many Hibakusha chose silence, hiding their past in order to integrate into society at the cost of living with memories they could not share. That silence lasted for years, creating a void in the nation's collective memory, where personal experiences were pushed to the margins of official history. At the same time, Hiroshima became a focal point for international scientific research on the effects of radiation on the human body. The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, established by the United States, began large-scale medical surveys of the Hibakusha. For many survivors, these examinations were both a source of hope and of deep resentment. They were examined, measured, and meticulously documented, yet very few received actual treatment. The feeling of being regarded as research subjects rather than patients left a profound psychological scar. Nevertheless, these studies gradually revealed the true scale of the disaster. Data showed a marked increase in cancer rates, particularly leukemia, within the Hibakusha community. These findings forced the Japanese government to confront its long-term responsibility toward the survivors. It was not until the mid-1950s that laws providing medical and welfare support for Hibakusha began to be enacted, measures that remained limited and often controversial. Within this context, individual voices slowly became a collective one. Some Hibakusha, overcoming fear and stigma, began to tell their stories publicly in schools, conferences, and international forums. Hiroshima ceased to be merely a place name and became a symbol of a global warning. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park was built near the hypocenter, with the atomic bomb dome preserved as an architectural witness to memory, not to glorify destruction, but to remind the world of its cost. For the survivors, this journey did not always bring complete healing. To recount memory was to relive pain. Yet it was also the only way to ensure their experiences were not buried beneath statistics and scientific reports. Over time, the Hibakusha moved from being silent victims to becoming historical witnesses, individuals bearing the responsibility of telling what no one else could. The post-war years shaped not only the lives of the Hibakusha, but also how the world came to understand nuclear weapons. Yet to fully grasp the global significance of Hiroshima, one must look beyond Japan's borders, tracing how the memory of the bombing spread and collided with politics, ethics, and nuclear fear. Throughout the decade, as Hiroshima slowly rose from the ashes, its story was no longer confined within Japan's borders. The atomic explosion moved beyond the framework of a military event to become a global moral and political turning point. The first images, the earliest scientific reports, and, above all, the testimonies of the Hibakusha began to circulate around the world, colliding with humanity's imagination in ways that were both profound and deeply unsettling. In the early years of the Cold War, Hiroshima and Nagasaki became names spoken in closed government chambers, military research institutes, and public debates about the future of warfare. Nuclear weapons, once viewed as a means to end World War II, rapidly transformed into symbols of humanity's capacity for self-destruction. The standoff between nuclear powers, most notably the United States and the Soviet Union, was built upon a terrifying paradox. Peace was preserved not through trust, but through mutual fear of total annihilation. In this context, Hiroshima ceased to be merely a historical site and became a living warning. The Hibakusha, initially pushed to the margins of society, were gradually invited to international forums where they shared their experiences with audiences who had never encountered war so directly. Their testimonies were not expressed in the language of politics or military strategy, but in the language of the human body of pain, loss, and memories that could not be erased. This contrast gave their stories a power far beyond that of statistics. For decades, the image of Hiroshima has been invoked as a symbol in movements opposing nuclear weapons. Nuclear tests in the Pacific, the Nevada desert, or Siberia revived fears that such a catastrophe could happen anywhere. Peace activists, scientists, and artists traveled to Hiroshima not only to commemorate, but to seek a shared language to articulate the unacceptable nature of nuclear war. The city became a global space of memory, where past and future continually confronted one another. Yet the legacy of Hiroshima has never been simple or one-dimensional. In many countries, debates over the use of atomic bombs continue, shaped by differing historical contexts, political realities, and moral perspectives. For some, the bombing is seen as a military decision intended to end the war and save soldiers' lives. For others, especially the Hibakusha Hiroshima, stands as evidence that no objective can justify the mass destruction of civilians. The tension between these views reflects the core contradiction of the nuclear age itself. Over time, as the first generation of Hibakusha has grown older, the fear of forgetting has become increasingly urgent. Survivors understand that their personal memories cannot last forever, and that history can be blurred or reinterpreted if not carefully preserved. Many have devoted their later years to speaking with students, university audiences, and international communities, not to incite resentment, but to convey a simple yet heavy message. What happened in Hiroshima must never be allowed to happen again. The moral legacy of Hiroshima, therefore, does not lie in a definitive conclusion, but in an open question that each generation must answer for itself. As technology continues to advance and humanity's capacity for destruction grows ever greater, the memory of Hiroshima forces us to confront ourselves, our limits of power, and the responsibility that accompanies it. In this light, Hiroshima does not belong only to the past. It becomes part of the present and the future, a reminder that history is not only something to be remembered, but something. As the 20th century drew to a close, Hiroshima entered a new phase, one in which memory was no longer carried solely by those who had directly witnessed the first flash of light, but was gradually passed on to generations born after the war. This transmission did not occur naturally or easily. It required deliberate effort from the Hibakusha, educators, historians, and local authorities, to ensure that the experiences of a specific group of people were not dissolved into the abstract flow of global history. For the second and third generations of Hiroshima, the atomic bombing is not a personal memory, but a complex, spiritual, and emotional legacy. Many grew up with fragmented stories told within families, often emerging unexpectedly when a small detail of everyday life suddenly reawakened the past. The smell of smoke, a flash of lightning during a storm, or simply a scorching summer day could trigger memories in the voices of parents or grandparents. For the descendants of the Hibakusha, receiving these memories is both educational and emotionally burdensome. Bound to quiet anxieties about health, heredity, and their own place within a historical narrative that has never fully closed. In the urban landscape of modern Hiroshima, memory is inscribed into architecture and space. The Peace Memorial Park is not merely a site of tourism or ceremony, but an open pedagogical environment where the past is presented not through dramatization, but through silence and reflection. The atomic bomb dome, standing quietly among modern buildings, creates a visual dialogue between destruction and reconstruction. For many young people, this image raises questions about the relationship between progress and responsibility, between humanity's creative power and its darker potential. Within Japan's formal education system, Hiroshima occupies a position that is both central and sensitive. Textbooks address the bombing in careful language, seeking to balance acknowledgement of the victims' suffering with the broader context of the war. Yet it is often outside the classroom through direct encounters with hibakusha, storytelling programs, and museum exhibitions that the memory of Hiroshima truly comes alive. As first-hand witnesses grow older, these encounters take on a sense of urgency, resembling a race against time to transmit what cannot be fully conveyed through books alone. On the international stage, Hiroshima continues to serve as a moral anchor in discussions about nuclear weapons. As arms control treaties are signed and challenged, and as geopolitical crises revive fears of nuclear conflict, the memory of Hiroshima is invoked as irrefutable historical evidence. Yet the passage of time also reshapes how the world receives this message. For generations that did not live under the shadow of the Cold War, Hiroshima risks becoming an abstract symbol, gradually losing the emotional weight rooted in concrete human experience. It is precisely in this context that personal testimony becomes especially vital. In their later years, many hibakusha emphasize that they do not wish to be seen solely as victims, but as bearers of responsibility. This responsibility is not to condemn, but to remind. They speak of an ordinary morning before the explosion, of simple hopes abruptly cut short, and of the long life that followed, in which each passing day carried the imprint of an irreversible event. Through these stories, Hiroshima is returned to the realm of human experience, escaping the risk of being confined within abstract concepts of strategy or technology. The question Hiroshima leaves for the present has no simple answer. It is not only a question of whether nuclear weapons should exist, but also of how humanity chooses to remember and learn from the past. In a world where technology continues to expand the limits of human power, Hiroshima reminds us that every form of progress carries the potential for profound harm. The memory of the bombing, therefore, is not a call to retreat into the past, but a demand placed upon the present, to remain in constant dialogue with history and not allow it to become a finished story. As the last witnesses gradually pass away, Hiroshima enters a fragile phase of memory, one in which continuity depends on the choices of those who never witnessed the event themselves. Recording, recounting, and reflecting on Hiroshima becomes a moral act not only for Japan, but for the entire world. For within the silence of the atomic bomb dome, in the rivers that once carried ash, and in the trembling voices of the hibakusha, there still echoes a question that has never grown old. What will humanity do with the power it has created? Hiroshima, after all the transformations brought by time, does not exist as a story that has been closed. The city continues to live and to change, yet it always carries within it a layer of memory inseparable from the present. That memory does not reside only in museums, history books, or annual commemorations, but exists within the very fabric of urban life, in the way people here speak about peace, and in the caution with which they approach the power that science and technology bring. For the last remaining hibakusha, telling their stories is not an act directed toward the past, but an effort to safeguard the future. They understand that when personal memory disappears, history risks being reduced to numbers, dates, and abstract debates. What they leave behind is not an imposed moral verdict, but a testimony. That war, once it crosses a certain threshold, no longer distinguishes between soldiers and civilians, knows no limits of time or generation, and leaves consequences far beyond any original strategic calculation. Hiroshima forces history to slow down. It does not allow talk of victory without acknowledgement of the cost, nor talk of progress without confronting its accompanying capacity for destruction. In the modern world, where crises can escalate rapidly and technology continues to expand the reach of human power, the memory of Hiroshima serves as a moral anchor. It offers no immediate solutions, but it establishes a spiritual boundary, reminding us that there are lines that should not be crossed. Seen through the testimonies of those who survived, the story of Hiroshima also reshapes how we understand history itself. History is not only the decisions of leaders or the outcomes of negotiations, but the sum of countless individual experiences, each carrying its own significance. In this way, Hiroshima becomes a lesson in the importance of listening to marginalized voices, those often absent from official narratives, yet upon whom history has left its deepest marks. In the silence of the Peace Memorial Park, where a bell rings each year in remembrance of the victims, one can sense an ongoing dialogue between past and present. This dialogue does not seek closure, but sustains a state of moral vigilance. Hiroshima does not ask the world to look back in resentment. It asks us to look directly at our own capacity to cause harm, and from there to make more responsible choices. As history continues to move forward and new challenges arise, Hiroshima remains a living memory. It exists not to freeze time, but to remind us that every generation holds both power and responsibility in shaping the future. The memory of the atomic bombing, carried through the voices of those who survived, thus becomes an inseparable part of humanity's shared heritage, a heritage not meant to glorify suffering, but to prevent its repetition. Hiroshima ends its story not with a period, but with a question passed through time. That question is not directed at the past, but squarely at the present and the future. When confronted with the power we ourselves have created, will humanity choose destruction, or will it choose restraint and humanity? The answer, as history has shown, is never guaranteed, but depends on the memory, awareness, and responsibility of each generation